Okay, we're continuing with episode 20 of Apothecary Diary. Maomao just wakes up from her injury, which, I still stand by my point that the depiction in the anime, which did follow the novel and also follow one version of the manga, is somewhat less accurate given the circumstance and the outcome. I still stand by that the other manga's version where the guard actually punched her in the face would have made more sense. Considering, although she had patch on her eye, she had head injury, bandages, there's no permanent damage on her head, let alone, being killed instantly by a blow like that, which is usually what happens. In the appendix of last episode, I did put on a link of what a pretty thin bar mace could do to things like animal skulls or watermelons. And that's a thin bar mace. This is basically a club, which is actually thicker and heavier. It not only makes no sense that she survived, even if she by luck would have survived, the head injury would have been much more severe than what's depicted in the show, which was that the more severe injury is actually her leg injury. Considering she didn't lose an eye, it didn't pop off, there's no permanent damage, a punch would have been sufficient. And the leg injury being the more severe one, where she had to be stitched up 15 times, that made a lot more sense. But once again, people's expectation from injuries have been grossly overextended throughout various media. People walk away from basically explosions and with no apparent internal damage and so on, that we're really desensitized to this. So I can understand the creative choice behind this, but just in terms of realism, that takes away a little bit. And for this episode, it's essentially just Detective Maomao. As I talked about with the first episode's appendix, this show is based on a light novel, and the light novel was actually quite well performing out of almost all the light novels throughout Japanese history. It's actually one of the top 5 in terms of volumes sold in total, ever. And another greatly popular detective manga anime in Japan, basically Detective Conan, the author actually included Maomao as one of the great fictional detectives on one of his additional works that got included with the full volume release of Detective Conan. So she's well recognized for that. Maomao did wake up in Jinshi's bedroom, which she did comment that it smelled like sandalwood. Sandalwood is a relatively aromatic wood grown in tropical regions in Southeast Asia that spread to India and then to China with Buddhism. This kind of wood is actually full of essential oils, so they have a slight but very distinct smell that actually helps calm the nerve and relaxes the person. But the thing is, because it's only grown in tropical regions, and a good sandalwood with a strong enough smell generally requires decades, if not hundreds of years of growth, it is a really rare source of aromatic and incense, so only the rich gets to use this. Other than that, when Maomao was performing the autopsy and finding out essentially the apparent mastermind behind this whole event, escaping death, we're shown with a plant that supposedly has this ability to fake death, which is Thornapple. Now, Thornapple actually comes in more variety than the ones shown in the show, which is white. They actually have various colors of flower. But generally speaking, although the effect might vary, all of these plants are poisonous. But at a very low dosage, they might have some medicinal or hallucinogenic effect. Some of them will have a medicinal effect, which is similar to what sedation will do. And in case if you're wondering, sedation, when done to a certain degree, would slow your heart rate and breathing so low that without modern medical equipment, you can't really tell if a person's heart is beating just by checking their pulse, because their pulse might beat maybe 5 or 6, almost 10 beats a minute, and if you check at the wrong time, and you wouldn't feel any pulse. Before the invention of ECG, an actual more advanced way of checking a person's sign of life, people only had pulses to go by. And because of that, these kind of medicinal plants and poisonous plants could be potentially used to fake death. Similarly, human bodies could potentially enter a stage of shock where the heart rate slows very slowly and almost feels like if the person is dead. That's why in pre-modern, even Victorian Europe, people were buried with a coffin and the bell attached to the coffin. So if the person wasn't really dead and woke up in the coffin, they'd pull on the bell and the bell would ring and people had to dig them up. In China, though, people did recognize similar potential that people might have this appearance of death without actually being dead. So funeral tradition in China was that the deceased would have to rest for a few days inside the coffin, essentially giving them a chance to potentially recover or wake up. And there were recorded cases of people essentially coming back to life after being laid in a coffin and laying inside the room rather than being buried for a few days. We now know that they weren't really dead. It was just this very slow heart rate and breathing. But back then people didn't know. So to them, it literally felt like coming back from death. And the thing is, Maomao basically went full Tanya from Yojo Senki in here, which is interesting and funny at the same time since they share the same voice actress. She went full Tanya for like a good maybe 10 seconds. I'm not sure if they're doing it intentionally or not, but it's funny enough, and if you know that they share the same voice actress, then this is a pretty funny in-joke. Of course, we're shown again that Maomao's wound starts bleeding, once again showing that the leg wound is actually more severe compared to her injury to the head. With that said, we're setting up with potentially the next conflict with the new concubine, and Jinshi actually talking to the new concubine, finding out a little bit about the situation. And let's just be honest, the girl likes to cosplay, essentially. She's shown wearing something that might look confusing because it's not her usual getup, but that looks more like a European-style blouse and nightgown. And we have a whole picture of her in various different costumes, which would have been considered cultural appropriation by some, maybe, and by modern standard. But let's just basically put it as it is. The girl likes to cosplay, which I have nothing against people who likes cosplay. It's just that you have to know that, like the Emperor in this show, there are people who just don't like it and don't find it like amusing at all. And essentially, this is just her and her hobby coming to conflict with the Emperor, who's not really impressed at all. Now, to be fair, throughout Chinese history, there were enough Chinese noble people that actually did enjoy dressing up exotically as well. Essentially pre-modern cosplayers. And one of the more famous examples actually came not in form of concubines in the royal palace, although some did enjoy dressing up exotically. Some emperors might not be amused at all. They might find that distasteful, but that was their view. But the thing is, there was one emperor who actually enjoyed dressing up as well, and that's the Yongzheng Emperor in Qing Dynasty China in the 1700s, essentially. This emperor is probably one of the most well-known workaholic emperor in the entire Chinese history, considering most of his recorded time offs and holidays were basically down to about 2 to 3 days a year. Like his birthday, New Year, and Lantern Festival, which is January 15th on the Chinese calendar. So he has 3 days of rest a year. Rest of the time is mostly working. And it really seemed like dressing up was his way of essentially relieving all the stress of being a workaholic. And funnily enough, the stuff that he dressed up as pretty random. He's dressed up as Buddhist monks, street beggars, Taoist priests, like Mongolian noblemen, Chinese scholars, well digger, common folk, and even European nobility with full wigs and like a tunic. That's usually not the Chinese wardrobe, but it's the 1700s. China already had contact with the West, so he's actually exposed to these kind of things. And that's just basically it. He's essentially the cosplay emperor. With that said, the new concubine's position might be somewhat similar to this emperor who was a workaholic, considering we have established that she's sent here because her family is a powerful regional nobleman, and there must have been a lot of pressure put on her. If anything, this might be her way of actually finding relief from all the stress. And that aside, we have a bit of expansion on Jinshi's backstory, which pretty much confirms that he's at least the Emperor's brother and potentially the Emperor's son. And depending on the kind of subtitle, or if you're actually using a subtitle when watching this, you might be a bit confused with Jinshi's conversation. Which is that when he said 10 odd years, it really just means that more than 10 years have passed. So it basically means that he's more than 10 years younger than his older brother, who's the emperor. Now, this more than 10-year depiction doesn't mean like 10 years period. It just means anywhere more than 10 years. It could have been up to 19, which is essentially Jinshi's age. But given different subtitles and different translation, that might not have been obvious to people because language context might sound different when you're putting them together with the English language. It did suggest that the emperor might be Jinshi's dad, and there's a whole potential for switch thing, and that could have happened when he said their age gap is 10 odd years, and we learned that in this world setting, at age 19, you're expected to start a family and have children already. So his age gap with the current emperor of less than 20 years, that's absolutely just normal by the standard. We learned from Gaoshen that his youngest son is 19, and similar age to this prince who's faking this identity of Jinshi. And as a dad, Gaoshen's expectation is that my son's already 19, he should start a family and get married. And if Jinshi is actually the current emperor's son, then their age difference might as well be 18 or 19 years. It's totally normal. The emperor just got married and had a kid at age 18-ish. That would have made sense. And since if the baby that died was the actual emperor's brother, then the emperor and the baby that died, their age gap would have been the difference between the emperor and Jinshi, since they were born at the same time. That's why they said 10 odd years basically means that the emperor is less than 20 when he had Jinshi. But you could be 19, you could be 18, and those were like normal ages. And we did learn a little bit about that. Jinshi doesn't want to think about it, most likely because Jinshi doesn't want the throne. Because currently there's no male heir, and without a son, then Jinshi will have to be the next in line, regardless of whether he is the emperor's son or if it's the emperor's brother. If the emperor has no children, then his younger brother will have to be the next emperor. And this may as well just be Jinshi's whole reason for running the rear palace, is that to get his brother/father another son so that he doesn't have to inherit the throne, because it doesn't feel like he feels like he's up to the task. And as we were basically going through that, we did learn that Gyokyo is more than likely pregnant. And essentially as a story plot, this just sets her up giving birth to potentially a son and having Jinshi's plan essentially work. Now at the very end, we're shown with Hook, maybe for the next episode, about one of the three, they say princesses in the Verdigris house. Once again, translation issue. This whole word hime is usually translated into princesses, but the thing is, princesses in English actually has a specific title attached to it. It's like the female equivalent of a prince, which hime might not be. It's most likely just like a lady. You know, Japanese high-ranking daimyos or warlords, their daughters would have been hime, but they're not princesses, considering only the emperor's daughters are princesses. So this essentially just like three ladies, but they're often translated as princesses. So just bear with that, with the confusion. And one of them is rumored to have been bought off. Now, we did talk about how brothels were run and what kind of place brothel really was back with ancient China. So it really didn't make much sense for me to see actually people sounding kind of sad that one of them was being bought off, because this would have been a much better alternative to their current situation. Now, for the military officer, for Lihaku, that makes sense. Like, if one of them is bought off and the one happens to be the one that he likes, he's missing out on the opportunity. More of a why couldn't it have been me situation. But for the rest of people, for everyone else, they should be happy about it. Because think about it, this life, as we talked about a few episodes ago, it's not a long-lasting career choice. Your expectancy, your career expectancy in this is quite short. And if anything, the longer you work in this industry, the more likelihood it is that you might end up like Maomao's mom, which we learned before what happened to her. And for any chance, although you're being bought, you're usually being bought into a well-off family, either as a private entertainer or as a concubine. So with any consideration, this is an upgrade to your current situation, which had no guarantee and most likely will end in tragedy. So as an outsider, as random people, as anyone else, just be happy for them if this is actually the situation. So I don't get why people are upset, because I get why Lee Ha-ku's upset, but he has his reasons. If anything, you should be happy if they're bought off. That means they have a ticket out of here. They have a way out. And that is more than I could say for a lot of other people in this show. And the theme in this show really has to do with society and the structure of society, and you basically having a very difficult time fighting against it. And somehow you still fight against it in a more subtle and low-level way, with, say, Jinshi actually basically fighting his potential fate of having to be the next emperor, with Maomao actually keeping a low profile but couldn't help with her when she comes across a mystery, with episode 3 with all the gimmick of actually going into the Rare Palace and getting out, just fighting the potential fate that's cast on you. And potentially with Gyokyo, who essentially had more or less quote-unquote lost the competition with Li Hua when she gave birth to a daughter and she gave birth to a son. But since her son died and she's pregnant again, she might have a chance of rising up through the rank if she gave birth to a son this time. And also with a new concubine Lolan dressing up in various costumes, maybe just fighting against the position that she's put in, which she couldn't really fight against. This might be her only way of combating. So that's a whole message behind a lot of things in this show. And if you have a ticket out of your current situation in this, then be happy for the characters.